Now, after considering reports on the school environment in the context of COVID-19, the Council of Education Ministers has decided not to phase in all grades next week. So, like I said, only grades 6, R and 11 pupils are expected to go back to school come Monday. This comes as more pupils and teachers are affected by the coronavirus, with growing calls for schools to remain closed. For reaction analysis, weighing in on this announcement, we're now joined by Dr. Sara Black, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Education Rights with the University of Johannesburg. The doc joins us via Skype in Cape Town. Doc, thanks very much for your time. Always great getting your insights. So one of the many questions is, if the situation doesn't allow for some pupils to get back to school, how does it allow for any pupils to be back in class?
Good morning, Ayanda, and good morning to your viewers. I think that you're really starting to go to the heart of one of the problems here around school opening in piecemeal and by only certain grades. And of course, the way that schools' influence and affluence allows them to open as well. So wealthy schools will be able to open, as we've discussed previously, in ways that poor schools won't. And people are starting to feel that this is a strategy that in fact exacerbates inequality and are questioning whether that is the right thing to do. So yes, definitely people are starting to, as you say, show the cracks about the decision-making and the way that those decisions have been communicated.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you've already made the links to inequality so quickly, but it also does raise questions about, from the time when the lockdown was first implemented to where we are now, do you think we've done enough to at least make headway in making sure that if schools have to continue, no one is left behind?
I'm afraid I don't think we have, Ayanda, not at all. We know that there are schools who still haven't received the water that they were promised in terms of the basic needs that had to be met before schools could reopen. We know that the decision differences between what's happening at national and what's happening at provincial level are creating a lot of confusion on the ground. I'm certainly aware of principals and teachers who are getting incredibly threatening messages about what will happen should they say that it's not safe to open. I can't obviously give you specifics on that because people are incredibly stressed and struggling to understand how to navigate this moment in a way that is ethical for their staff and their parents and their students at the same time. But really, there are schools who are saying they're not getting cleaned. There are schools that are saying they're running out of PPE equipment. And as some of the analysis I've been doing with other colleagues is that actually it's the deeper fundamental structural issues that make schooling so unsafe right now. The absence of hygiene equipment, the absence of adequate classrooms, and the absence of adequate staffing numbers. And those things obviously are going to bite in poor schools hardest, where we also know that the infection rates tend to spread the quickest.
Yeah, absolutely. But part of the big defense from the Education Department, government in general, is that life must go on, even during the pandemic in and of itself. Is it enough that young children, specifically those in certain years without comorbidities, aren't infectious as perhaps anybody else? I mean, is that type of reasoning justification enough to at least allow some concessions for some pupils to return to class?
I think there is some kind of comfort in knowing that children are less vulnerable. That certainly does make the complex set of variables that one has to think about when opening schools a little bit easier. But as many of the teachers that I have spoken to are saying, and was predicted before we even opened up for one grade, the amount of teaching and learning that's happening right now in schools is minimal. Between all the disinfecting and the screening and the PPEs and the rejigging of the timetable again and again as some people have to leave and isolate and others have to come in for them, schools right now are not really getting through a heck of a lot of teaching and learning. They are more being seen as spaces where parents can leave their children when they go to work. And of course, there is a very important court case right now happening around children getting access to food. But I do think that the government is not necessarily being creative enough in going, how can we make sure schools are, how do we make sure children are fed? How do we make sure children are safe without reopening schools as if they can kind of go back to normal? Because they haven't gone back to normal, far from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, part of the growing concerns is the trajectory we're seeing everywhere else in the world, where allowing children to go back to school essentially results in a spike in the infections, and we have to roll back that decision. But I want to delve into, something you've touched on, and that has to do with the integrity of the academic year as things stand? If not enough schooling is already taking place in any case, who actually stands to win and lose if we forge ahead with the opening of schools amid increasing number of coronavirus infections?
I think we know who stands to win and lose. Those who are able to continue learning online in the comfort of a home where children can be given safe spaces to do so, given an adult who can support them to learn online, they are going to manage all right. Those are what I would recommend, maybe 10 to 15% of the children in this country. The other 80 to 85% don't have that option. And I do think that there are alternatives that haven't been considered seriously. For example, radio and TV. I don't feel that those have been leveraged heavily enough that could access children who are poor. I don't know if we've really been creative about how feeding schemes could also send work home for children who don't have access to internet, etc. And also how you could keep a pulse, this is my own thought on it, keep a pulse on how families are doing under the coronavirus conditions by just checking with children as they slowly come through for a feeding scheme where you can keep the social distancing measures, the child can get their food for the day, and you can also say, how are things at home? Has anyone lost their job? Has anyone got a cough? Take this pack of work to do this week. We hope that you find it interesting. Give us a call if there's a problem. So it's not about shutting everything that schools do down. We know that they are important hubs of activity for communities, and they're often places children get essentials like food. But we don't have to just reopen them again as if nothing's going on. We can do things differently, and I don't know how much of that has really been taken seriously at a decision-making level.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about decisions. Parents are going to have to decide how they're going to respond to this. Where on earth do they even start?
That's a really tough question, and I imagine it's been a source of anxiety for parents around the country at the moment. They must be having many, many sleepless nights.
Yeah.
But most of the parents I have been speaking to reflect your sports anchor's comment prior to this segment, which is they prioritize the life of their child. One student who was picketing outside Heathfield Secondary School on the M5 here in Cape Town, she had a lovely placard. It said, we'd rather skip a grade than dig a grave. And that was, I thought, really summed it up nicely.
And, you know, I guess as we entertain different scenarios, that is becoming a very real prospect. How much of a blow really is it to, you know, the education system? Because often I think there's even fear-mongering when people start explaining the ripple effects or the cause to effect when people have to start repeating grades next year, possibly. Have we quantified what this would take?
I don't have hard and fast data on this, Ayanda. I think actually getting hold of any kind of empirical data is driving researchers nuts right now because we obviously can't access schools. Even human rights monitors are struggling to access schools at the moment. But one of the things that I do find contradictory amongst the voices who are calling for schools to return very quickly is this emphasis on curriculum and grade repetition, like you say, as if enormous amounts of learning was happening in the schools for our poor anyway. It's a nasty truth, but it is the truth that most of our children are not learning enough when they go to school when things are normal. At the moment, they're not learning much at all. So it's not a question of throwing away a fantastic academic year for total loss of learning. It's throwing away a struggling school's inability to cover the curriculum because they don't have toilets, rooms and staff, to maybe getting children in for a babysitting service. I know that sounds like a bit of a bleak picture, but it's contradictory for those who would constantly say how schools are not affecting teaching and learning to now say schools must open because they're losing out on teaching and learning. And that doesn't make sense to me. I don't think that the ripple effects, as you say, are as grossly drastic as they are being portrayed. There are alternatives. Some have been put forward by some of the smaller unions about using grade 11 results for grade 12s. We know that ECD is totally not being included in this conversation right now. ECD centres have still not been allowed to open. So what's happening to the kids who would come into grade R and grade 1 next year when they are just sitting at home right now and not in ECD centres? So the way that the whole system kind of sits as a continuum is not actually being analysed in seriousness, I don't think. It's just this, as you say, fear-mongering. The hamster wheel cannot stop.
Absolutely.
Ever.
Well, As always, great insights coming through from Dr. Sara Black. Let me thank you for your time. I really appreciate you weighing in. Dr. Sara Black is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Education, Rights and Transformation with the University of Johannesburg. Doc, once again, thanks very much for your time indeed.